The howling wind carried Katherine Kelsey's desperate prayers across the vast Montana territory as she clutched her 6-month-old daughter Emma to her chest, the stagecoach lurching beneath them. April 1885 had brought unexpected snow, and Katherine's thin coat did little to protect either of them from the biting cold that seeped through the cracks of the weathered vehicle. "Next stop, Riverstone," the driver called out, his voice nearly lost to the wind. Katherine's stomach tightened. After 3 weeks of grueling travel from Boston, she would finally meet Mitchell Keller, the man whose advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper had promised salvation for her and Emma. A rancher seeking a wife, he'd written with eloquence about his prosperous cattle operation and fine home awaiting the right woman. What she hadn't mentioned in her reply was Emma, the daughter born of her brief marriage to a man who died of influenza before ever seeing his child. "Madam, we're here," the driver announced, jarring Katherine from her thoughts as the stagecoach rolled to a stop in what appeared to be the main street of Riverstone. The town was smaller than she'd imagined, a collection of wooden buildings lining a muddy street, nothing like the bustling prosperity she'd envisioned from Mitchell's letters. The April weather had turned the street into a quagmire, and Katherine carefully descended from the coach, balancing Emma in one arm while clutching her small valise in the other. "Mr. Keller was supposed to meet me," Katherine told the driver, scanning the few people braving the cold afternoon. The driver's face fell. "Madam, you might want to check at the general store. Mrs. Henderson would know where to find him." The unease in his voice made Katherine's heart quicken as she trudged through the mud toward the store, Emma fussing against her shoulder. Inside, the warmth was immediate, and Katherine found herself facing a plump woman with graying hair and kind eyes. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm Katherine Kelsey. I've come to meet Mitchell Keller." The store fell silent. The few customers stopped their browsing to stare at her with expressions ranging from pity to curiosity. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Henderson said softly, "I'm so sorry. Mitchell Keller died 3 weeks ago. Influenza swept through the eastern part of the county." The room tilted beneath Katherine's feet. "But I just received a letter from him 2 weeks ago." "Mails slow out here," an older man by the counter explained. "Mitchell took sick real sudden-like. Wasn't more than 4 days between first sniffles and burial." Emma began to cry, perhaps sensing her mother's distress. Katherine bounced her gently, trying to process this devastating news. She'd spent nearly everything she had on the journey west. "What am I to do?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "Mrs. Henderson placed a comforting hand on Katherine's arm. "You can stay with us tonight. My husband and I have a spare room." "Thank you," Katherine managed, blinking back tears. "There's a place you might want to check," offered a young woman by the dry goods shelf. "Mason Keene's ranch. He lost his wife and baby to the same fever that took Mitchell. His foreman was in yesterday saying he's looking for a housekeeper." "Mason's not exactly sociable these days," Mrs. Henderson cautioned. "Lost everything that mattered to him. Lives alone at that big ranch house now, barely comes to town." "But he pays fair," the younger woman insisted. "And it's decent work for a woman alone." Katherine looked down at Emma, who had quieted and was now staring up with curious eyes. Without Mitchell Keller and his promises, they had nowhere to go. Her parents had made it clear they wouldn't welcome back a daughter who'd married against their wishes, especially not with a granddaughter they refused to acknowledge. "Where is this ranch?" Katherine asked. "About 5 miles west of town," Mrs. Henderson replied. "My husband can take you out there tomorrow if you're set on it." That night, lying in the Hendersons' spare bed with Emma nestled against her, Katherine allowed herself to cry silently. All her hopes a new beginning, a decent man to help raise Emma, A life away from the whispers and judgment of Boston society had crumbled in an instant. Morning brought weak sunshine and a renewed determination. Katherine dressed carefully in her one good dress, a deep blue wool that complemented her auburn hair. She fed and changed Emma, packing their few belongings back into the valise. Mr. Henderson drove them to the Keene ranch in his wagon, the journey taking nearly an hour over rutted, muddy roads. The landscape was breathtaking in its vastness, rolling hills dotted with pine trees, snow-capped mountains in the distance, and open grasslands where cattle grazed. "That's it," Mr. Henderson said as they crested a hill. Below them stretched a substantial ranch, a large two-story house, several outbuildings, corrals, and a barn. Katherine's nervousness grew as they approached. "Mr. Henderson, I haven't told you everything. I came here to be Mitchell Keller's bride, not his housekeeper. I don't know if Mr. Keene will hire a woman with a baby." The older man's expression softened. "Mason Keene's a complicated man since losing his family, but he's fair. Just be honest with him." The wagon pulled up to the house, and Katherine noticed the neglected appearance of what had once been a beautiful home. The paint was peeling and the garden beds lay empty and overgrown. Before they could dismount, the front door opened and a man stepped onto the porch. Katherine's breath caught. Mason Keene was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that couldn't hide his strong jawline. But it was his eyes that held her, deep brown and filled with such profound sadness that Katherine felt it like a physical blow. "Mr. Henderson," he called, his voice deep and rough. "What brings you out here?" "Got someone you might want to meet," the storekeeper replied, helping Katherine down from the wagon. Mason's eyes narrowed as he took in Katherine, and then widened when she turned slightly, revealing Emma in her arms. "Mr. Keene," Katherine said, summoning her courage. "My name is Katherine Kelsey. I understand you might be in need of a housekeeper." Mason descended the porch steps slowly. "I am, but I wasn't expecting." "A baby," Katherine finished for him. "Yes, this is my daughter, Emma. She's 6 months old and very well behaved." Mason's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Kelsey, it's Miss," Katherine corrected, then faltered. "Well, technically Mrs., but my husband passed before Emma was born." "I'm sorry for your loss," Mason said automatically, though his expression remained guarded. "Miss Kelsey, a ranch is no place for a baby." Katherine lifted her chin. "I came to Riverstone to marry Mitchell Keller. I arrived yesterday to learn he'd died. I have nowhere else to go, Mr. Keene. I'm a hard worker. I can cook, clean, mend, and keep accounts. All I ask is a fair wage and a safe place for my daughter and me to live." Something flickered in Mason's eyes, recognition of her desperation, perhaps. "Mason," Mr. Henderson interjected gently, "might be good to have someone bring life back to this place." A heavy silence fell as Mason studied Katherine and Emma. His gaze lingered on the baby, and Katherine saw the pain wash over his features before he masked it. "Room and board plus $10 a month," Mason finally said. "You can use the room at the back of the house. It has its own entrance. 3 months trial. If it doesn't work out, I'll pay your fare back east." Relief weakened Katherine's knees. "Thank you, Mr. Keene. We won't disappoint you." Mason nodded curtly and turned back toward the house. "Get settled, then come to the kitchen. I'll show you where everything is." As Mr. Henderson helped carry her trunk into the small but clean room that would be their new home, Katherine tried to calm her racing heart. This wasn't the life she'd traveled west for, but it was a chance, a beginning. The first week at the Keene ranch was a study in silence. Mason left before dawn each day and returned after dark, taking his meals in his study or with his ranch hands in the bunkhouse. Katherine cleaned years of neglect from the house, finding evidence of the family Mason had lost everywhere, a woman's hairbrush still on the dresser in the master bedroom. Tiny baby clothes folded in a chest. A family portrait showing a smiling Mason beside a pretty blonde woman holding a newborn. His wife's name had been Sarah. Katherine learned from Pete, the elderly cook who prepared meals for the ranch hands. Their son, just 3 months old when the fever took them, had been named James. "Mason ain't been the same since," Pete told her one afternoon when he'd stopped by the main house. "Used to be the most gregarious man in 3 counties. Now he barely speaks." By the second week, Katherine had established a routine. She rose early to feed Emma, then prepared breakfast. She cleaned and did laundry while Emma napped, prepared lunch and dinner, and spent evenings mending clothes or reading from the surprisingly well-stocked bookshelf in the parlor. It was during one such evening that Mason finally broke the silence between them. Katherine had put Emma down for the night and was sitting by the fire, darning one of Mason's socks when he entered the parlor. "You don't have to do that," he said, gesturing to the sock in her hands. Katherine looked up, startled by his presence. "It's part of my duties." Mason hesitated, then sat in the chair opposite her. "The house looks better, thank you. There's still much to do." "Your daughter, Emma, she seems happy." Katherine smiled, her first genuine smile in his presence. "She's a contented baby. I'm fortunate." Mason nodded, his eyes drifting to the flames. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned you came west to marry Mitchell Keller." "Yes," Katherine confirmed, setting aside her mending. "We corresponded for 6 months. He seemed like a good man." "He was," Mason agreed. "We weren't close, but everyone respected him." Silence fell again, but it felt different now, less strained. "Your cooking is good," Mason finally said. "Better than Pete's, though don't tell him I said so." Katherine laughed softly. "Your secret is safe." For a moment, something like a smile touched Mason's lips before disappearing. He stood abruptly. "Good night, Miss Kelsey." "Good night, Mr. Keene." It was a small interaction, but Katherine went to bed feeling hopeful for the first time since arriving at the ranch. The next morning, Katherine woke to Emma's hungry cries just before dawn. After feeding her, she carried her daughter to the kitchen to begin breakfast, only to find Mason already there, coffee brewing on the stove. "You're up early," Katherine observed, surprised. Mason turned, his eyes immediately going to Emma, who was watching him with curious eyes. "I always am, just usually eat with the men." Katherine shifted Emma to her other hip. "I can prepare something for you here if you'd prefer." Mason's gaze lingered on Emma. "She has your eyes." The observation caught Katherine off guard. Emma's eyes were indeed the same shade of green as her own, something her husband had never lived to see. "Would you like to hold her?" Katherine offered impulsively. "While I cook." Mason stepped back as if she'd threatened him. "I don't think it's all right," Katherine said quickly. "I understand." But the next morning Mason was in the kitchen again, and the next. By the end of the week, it had become their routine sharing coffee while Katherine prepared breakfast, Mason occasionally asking questions about her life before coming west. Katherine learned that Mason had built the ranch from nothing, arriving in Montana territory 10 years earlier with little more than determination and skill with horses. He'd met Sarah in Riverstone, where she'd been teaching at the small schoolhouse. "We had 2 good years together," he told Katherine one morning, his voice low. "Then the fever came through last fall, took them both within days of each other." Katherine's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry, Mason." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and his eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Spring strengthened its hold on the land. The snow melted completely, revealing tender green grass beneath. Katherine planted a vegetable garden beside the house and flowers along the front walkway. Emma began to crawl, exploring the kitchen floor while Katherine cooked, always under her watchful eye. One evening in late May, Katherine was hanging laundry when she heard horses approaching. Mason returned from town earlier than expected, dismounting fluidly before tying his horse to the hitching post. "Miss Kelsey," he called, approaching with a package in his hands. "Mr. Keene," she replied, noting how the sun had darkened his skin, highlighting the blue-black of his freshly trimmed beard. "I brought something," he said, holding out the package. "For Emma." Surprised, Katherine took it, unwrapping the paper to find a beautifully carved wooden rattle. "Old Jim at the general store makes them," Mason explained, suddenly appearing uncomfortable. "I thought she might like it." Katherine blinked back unexpected tears. "That's very thoughtful, thank you." Mason nodded, his eyes lingering on her face before he turned away. That night after Emma was asleep, Katherine found Mason on the front porch staring out at the star-filled sky. "May I join you?" she asked. He nodded, and she settled into the chair beside him. "Your 3 months are nearly up," Mason said after a long silence. Katherine's heart sank. She'd lost track of time, settling into life at the ranch so completely that she'd forgotten the conditional nature of their arrangement. "Yes, I suppose they are. Are you planning to move on?" His voice was carefully neutral. Katherine swallowed hard. "Do you want me to?" Mason turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "No." The single word hung between them, charged with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. "Then I'll stay," Katherine whispered. Summer brought long, bright days and new challenges. A particularly dry June had everyone worried about wildfire, and the ranch hands worked tirelessly to ensure adequate water supplies for the cattle. Katherine's garden flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables for their meals. Emma grew more active by the day, now pulling herself up on furniture and attempting her first wobbly steps. Katherine often caught Mason watching the baby with a complex mixture of emotions on his face: longing, sadness, and something like wonder. One sweltering July afternoon, Katherine was reading on a blanket beneath the large oak tree in the side yard, Emma playing with wooden blocks beside her, when Mason approached. He'd been working with the horses all morning, and his shirt clung to him, dampened by sweat. "She's growing fast," he observed, crouching down to Emma's level. The baby immediately abandoned her blocks, crawling toward him with determination. Before either adult could react, Emma had pulled herself up using Mason's knee and was standing unsteadily, beaming up at him with a toothless smile. "Well, look at you," Mason said softly, his voice filled with genuine delight. Emma reached up with her small hands, clearly wanting to be lifted. Mason glanced at Katherine, uncertainty in his eyes. "It's all right," Katherine assured him. With surprising gentleness, Mason lifted Emma, settling her against his chest. The baby immediately patted his beard with curious fingers, and a smile broke across Mason's face, the first full, unguarded smile Katherine had seen from him. "She likes you," Katherine said, her heart swelling at the sight. "Smart kid," Mason replied, the joke surprising them both. That evening, instead of retreating to his study after dinner as usual, Mason joined Katherine in the parlor. They sat in comfortable silence for a while before Mason spoke. "I've been thinking about expanding the herd next spring," he said. "Maybe building another corral on the north side." "That sounds like a good plan," Katherine replied, wondering why he was sharing this with her. "It would mean building onto the house as well." "The foreman's cabin is too far from the new corral," Katherine nodded, still confused. "I'm sure you'll manage it." Mason set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Katherine, I'm not explaining myself well." He took a deep breath. "I've become accustomed to having you and Emma here." "More than accustomed. I look forward to coming home now." Catherine's heart began to race. "Mason, I know I'm not what you came west for," he continued quickly. "I'm not the man I was before Sarah and James died, but I hope I could be a good husband to you and a father to Emma." Catherine stared at him, speechless. In the month she'd lived at the ranch, her feelings for Mason had grown steadily, but she'd never dared hope he might return them. "You don't have to answer now," Mason said, misinterpreting her silence. "It's just something to consider." "Yes," Catherine said, finding her voice. Mason blinked. "Yes, you'll consider it." "Yes, I'll marry you," Catherine clarified, her cheeks flushing. "If you're certain it's what you want." Mason crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling before her chair and taking her hands in his. "I haven't been certain of anything since I lost them," he confessed. "Until you and Emma came into my life." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When their lips met, Catherine felt warmth spread through her entire being. Mason's kiss was tender at first, then deepened with a hunger that matched her own. When they finally broke apart, Mason pressed his forehead to hers. "I thought my heart died with Sarah and James," he whispered. "You brought it back to life." They were married 2 weeks later in Riverstone's small church, with Emma balanced on Catherine's hip throughout the brief ceremony. The town turned out in force, curious about the woman and child who had managed to breach Mason Keene's walls of grief. "Never thought I'd see the day," Pete told Catherine at the small reception at the Henderson store. "You've performed a miracle, Mrs. Keene." The name still felt new on Catherine's ears, but it filled her with pride. Mrs. Mason Keene, a name she hadn't traveled west to claim, but one that now represented everything she held dear. That evening, after settling Emma in what was now her permanent nursery adjacent to the master bedroom, Catherine joined Mason on the porch. He pulled her into his arms, and they stood watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. "I received a letter from the bank in Billings today," Mason said, his chin resting atop her head. "The cattle sale went through. We've secured the grazing rights to the North Valley." Catherine smiled at his use of "we." In just a few months, she'd gone from desperate and alone to being half of something strong and growing. "I've been thinking," she said, turning in his arms to face him, "about adding onto the house in another way. Perhaps a second nursery next to Emma's room." Mason stilled, his eyes searching hers. "Catherine, are you saying—" She took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "Emma will have a brother or sister come spring." Mason's expression transformed, joy and wonder replacing his usual reserved demeanor. He lifted Catherine off her feet, spinning her in a circle as she laughed. "I love you," he said when he set her down, the words coming easily now. "I love you both, all 3 of you." "And we love you," Catherine replied, reaching up to touch his face. As darkness settled over the ranch, Catherine reflected on the strange path that had led her here. She'd come west seeking security and found devastating loss instead. But from that loss had come a love deeper and more profound than anything she could have imagined. Mason's arm tightened around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "How sometimes the greatest blessings come from our most difficult trials," she answered honestly. Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. They both knew the cost of love and loss, and the courage it took to open one's heart again. 5 years later, the Keene ranch had transformed. The house gleamed with fresh paint, and the garden Catherine had planted that first spring now wrapped around the entire property in a riot of color. The north addition Mason had envisioned was complete, housing not only expanded ranch operations, but also the growing Keene family. Emma, now nearly 6, raced across the yard with her 3-year-old brother James and 2-year-old sister Sarah chasing behind her. Catherine watched from the porch, her hand resting on her once again swollen belly, while Mason supervised the children's play. "Careful with your sister," he called as Emma swung little Sarah in a circle. The sound of laughter, both children's and adults, was a constant at the ranch now. The grief that had once permeated every corner had been replaced by joy, not erasing the past, but building something new alongside it. When Katherine had first arrived at the Keene ranch that cold April day, a desperate woman with a baby and nowhere else to turn, she could never have imagined the life awaiting her. She had found not just shelter, but a home, not just employment, but purpose, not just a provider, but a partner who loved her completely. Mason caught her watching and smiled, that full, unguarded smile that still made her heart race. He excused himself from the children's game and joined her on the porch, placing his hand atop hers on her belly. "Feeling all right today?" he asked, concern in his eyes. "Perfect," Katherine assured him, leaning into his strength. "Everything is perfect." And as the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the land in golden light, Katherine knew she had found something far greater than what she'd sought when she'd traveled west as a mail-order bride. She had found a man who'd lost everything but his heart, and had given that heart to her and her children, creating a love that would sustain them through whatever life might bring.